Hi friends, this is not Daryl, this is John, and I'd like to share with you my project number 2, which I used James G's paper. In particular, I focused on the section from about page 90 to about page 95, which deals with academic language. So this is about take number 10 or 11, so bear with me. Let's try and get this one right. And I'm going to share my screen with you. And I'm going to minimize my picture. All right. So there's the information I was speaking about. And I'm going to start with the takeaway messages. The message that was that jumped out at me of several things. That paper was very broad in what its scope. But my particular interest is teaching academic language while I teach content, and teaching content while I teach academic language. So one of the most important tools for learning in the content areas like mathematics and science is mastery of the specialist varieties of language these areas use, varieties that are often referred to as academic language. Learning in the content areas is a form of language development. And like all forms of development, it is for the most part dependent on specific forms of social interaction with masters, people who know the form of language, and peers. This idea of register comes from something that I'm become interested in over the years, which is systemic functional linguistics. All students arrive with school with a register. What's more, they arrive to school with many registers, but the common everyday spoken vernacular or language is that's our dominant register that we speak when we're comfortably with our friends and family. The idea of a register comes from Michael Halliday's system of functional linguistics, systemic functional linguistics, and refers to the connection between language, symbols, and the circumstances set by the environment and context. Registers change between environments because language and communication vary between one context and another. For example, high school students might be out playing basketball in gym, and the register, how they communicate with one another, is completely different during that ball game than it is in their next class, which might be physics. So they have multiple registers, and then on their bus ride home, they might have a completely different register that they use, or when they're with their family at dinner. So the context, the circumstances of the environment are gonna change the communication needs of the students, and they're going to adapt to that by changing their register. So SFL scholars look at register as being composed of 3 parts. Every communication is essentially 3 different communications in one. And the first part is called the field, the second part is called the tenor, and the third is the mode. So field is the set of ideas, and SFL scholars will call that the ideational. The tenor is the interpersonal or the emotional, and that also involves power dynamics. For example, if you speak to a police officer that has pulled you over for a ticket, you talk differently with him than you might if he wasn't in his uniform and you were sharing a cup of coffee. That is an example because the power dynamics are different there. So you would change your tenor when you're speaking with them. Another example is I started always using Dr. Ernest when I opened an email to Daryl, and now I just write DE, or depending if I'm asking for another extension, I might say Dr. Ernest. And then the last one is mode, and mode is the structure or the organization of the communication. in part the syntax of the language, but in more than just the grammar. It's also how you put the order of which you're going to put things, or the way you want to tell things. You know, like what do you want first, the good news or the bad news? That sort of thing is also part of the mode. So the academic register, the academic language, that consists of the field, and the field would be the particular concepts, topics, data, and particularly the unique vocabulary words of a particular discipline. In academic language, the tenor is often impersonal. You get a lot of declarative sentences. You don't find many personal pronouns. So that would all create this distance between the reader and the writer of it not being a heart-to-heart discussion. It's more of a brain-to-brain discussion. And the third part, the mode, grammar, there's a very particular way of crafting a scholarly message, and that is what we all learn to do when we go to school, and that is called the mode. So for example, in science writings, particular words have different meanings in the common vernacular than they do in science. For example, a theory, or weight, or evolution. Each of those has a common meaning in the common vernacular, and they have very different meanings in science. Also, science, of course, has a tremendous amount of particular content knowledge, and that's all part of the field. Science is very much an impersonal language tenor, created again with declarative sentences, no personal pronouns or a lack of personal pronouns. Science has particular formats or patterns or modes, which would include graphs. That might include making, like on a lab report, the list of materials. But it also could include other things, such as often as you read a science text, you find that the second part of a clause, the information part of a clause, known as the predicate, some piece of that information will then be pulled into the next sentence to become the subject of the next sentence. So what writers are doing is they're joining their ideas one to the other in a very sequential and logical fashion. And one of the secret mode patterns is to grab a word or an idea from the predicate and make it the subject of the next clause. And that in SFL is called the zigzag pattern. And I'll show you an example of how I teach that. So I'd like to share with you some of how I teach this in my classroom. And one of the first examples I'd like to show you is a series of lessons that I call In the News, where I have students analyze often the lead story of NBC Nightly News, and I have them analyze it for field, tenor, and mode. I'll show you an example of a science lesson where I teach the zigzag pattern. You'll see how content and that mode feature are both taught at the same time. And whenever I assign a reading, there's always some feature of academic language that I ask students to analyze it for. Okay, so I'm going to try and pause. Okay, and now I'd like to show you some sample lessons. I'm going to share my screen again. And this first lesson that you see is a vocabulary graphic organizer. So I introduced the terms, and so the 6 terms that we're studying here are field, tenor, and mode, participants, circumstance, and journalism. And then I define the 6 terms, and then we analyze a sentence with those terms in them. And then we do a matching exercise, matching the correct vocabulary term with the correct definition. And so underneath there, you see that what I'm doing is I'm introducing, I'm defining, I'm connecting. And now the last part is identify and summarize. So this is the identify part, and then summarize. So each word is dropped down the left-hand side. Students define it. They say, give a synonym or a translation into their home language, or a synonym if they're an English speaker. Most of my students are English language learners. So this gets them ready to know and to use what they call the SFL meta language, the language about language, and those SFL terms about register that I just spoke about. So this one is one that that's a sample one that I filled in. So the students, they get the main idea of the lesson outlined for them. They watch the lead story, usually runs about 5 minutes. And then they identify the particular participants who are in the story. They create a list of characteristics or qualities or properties associated with the participants, descriptions. And then they describe the circumstances of the story of where, when, and how. And those are all parts of the field. Participants, process, descriptions, and circumstance are all the 4 parts of field. And then we list emotions that the story elicits, and then we explain why and how the story created those emotions in us. And so that's our study of tenor. And then we talk about power dynamics, or and then relate whatever the social relationships are to ourselves and to our own lives. And then we try and rename the story. If this was going to be a headline, what is the headline to the story? And we write a summary of the story using our analysis of who, what, when, where, and how for the field, and tenor, the social relationships and power dynamics. And we explain the mode, how the story was told. So those are examples of teaching field, tenor, and mode. This is a purely mode example where I'm teaching the content of the scientific method. So the first page is essentially one large explanation of the zigzag pattern. And you'll notice that even the directions use the zigzag pattern. So here we have a paragraph, and I'm going to read it to you about the scientific method. Science studies nature in a rational and systematic fashion. The system that makes science systematic is called the scientific method. The scientific method uses a sequence of steps to discover information about nature. There are 6 steps in the scientific method: ask a question, make observations and do research, form a hypothesis, perform a controlled experiment, analyze data from the experiment, and interpret and report your findings. So then I've broken each sentence of that paragraph down. So the first sentence, the subject is science. What information do we learn about science? Science studies nature in a rational and systematic fashion. Now, some piece of that information from the predicate, in particular, the idea of being systematic, is grabbed and then brought down to become the subject of the next sentence. So the system is the subject of the next sentence. The system that makes science systematic is called the scientific method. So we have an idea, and then we have the development of that idea. A piece of that development or that information is grabbed, the scientific method, and brought down to become our new subject. The scientific method uses a sequence of steps to discover information about nature. And what does the next sentence begin with? There are 6 steps. So a sequence of steps brings down, and this is why they call it the zigzag. So we have the zig, we have the zag, the zig, and then the zag. If you break up the sentence into, if you break the paragraph up into individual clauses. So I want the students to look for the zigzag pattern when they read, and I want them to start using it when they write. So on page 2, I essentially have just taken the textbook and written the paragraph out. So the first part, I'm again modeling for them the zig and the zag, the zig and the zag, and then I begin doing it with them in this section. And then we start doing it together in the true paragraph form. And then we have a writing prompt, which is explain the zigzag pattern. And how am I asking them to describe the zigzag pattern? Present the idea or introduce it, explain or define the term, provide an example of the zigzag pattern, and link the zigzag pattern to a better understanding of what you read and write. So there's a particular pattern to this explanation, which is peel, present, explain, example, link. And that is a classic sequence of things to do when you write an explanation in academic language. So I'm getting them used to doing this sequence. And the next lesson I'll show you is about matter and energy. So I start with these commands or things that they want to do: define matter, analyze science text for process, key terms, definitions, subject, predicate, and the zigzag pattern, and recognize that there's an interaction between matter and energy. So this first paragraph, we are going to highlight, just as a part of acknowledging the main ideas. That's where we're going to start, is highlighting the main ideas. And then we're going to read the paragraph and follow this prompt. We're going to highlight all of the processes or actions or verbs with pink. And later on, that's going to help us separate the subject from the predicate. And we're going to highlight all of the scientific vocabulary words with, not with pink. We're going to do that with yellow. And then one of the things that I'm teaching the students is that science writing often will define the terms in it. For example, like when I gave them the writing prompt. The second part of the prompt is first you explain and then you define. And so I want them to start looking for definitions embedded in science writing. And then we want to look, I hate it when the pen doesn't match the lining of the spacing. So then we want to find textual evidence to define these terms. And now this is all about the matter and energy, all about the relationship between matter and energy. We're going to find the processes. Then that's going to make it easier for us to find the subject and the predicate. And then students are going to begin to see that, oh, look, there's the zigzag pattern. Oh, oh my goodness, well, tiny particles. Well, look, and then the next sentence begins with atoms. They begin to find the zigzag pattern on their own. And the last one that I'll show you is a graphic organizer for cause and effect. So we have a small paragraph to read, and we're looking again for processes of verbs and vocabulary words. And then we're going to have a graphic image of what's talked about above. And we're going to, in our groups, we're going to study, discuss this, and then I give them prompts for particular things to read and understand. And then we're going to talk about what is the cause of hot and cold? What is the cause of temperature? Well, ultimately, it's an increase or decrease in temperature. An increase or a decrease in energy, which causes the effect of motion, increased or decreased motion, which causes the effect of hot and cold or temperature. And once again, we're going to use the peel pattern to explain how the cause and effect of increasing and decreasing energy causes an increase and a decrease in temperature. And that is how examples of how I teach academic language while I teach content. Thank you for your attention.